everyone, I'm Nicole from SFA. Welcome to the second part of the PDPA series. Today we'll be discussing how to implement a data protection management plan for your organization and how to use the PDPA online assessment tools to improve your personal data protection policies and practices. Joining us today is Justin from Raja and Tan. Along the way, if you all have any questions, please feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A section below. I'll now hand over the time to him.
Right, thanks a lot, Nicole. Welcome to everyone who is joining us for this webinar. To those who attended the first session as well, welcome back. Good to see you all again. As mentioned by Nicole, hi, I'm Justin. I'm the speaker appointed by the PDPC to conduct this three-part webinar, of which today is the second part. I'm a partner at Raja and Tan, handling technology, media, and telecommunications, and part of that practice includes data protection. I'm also, coincidentally, an SFA member. We had a good trip with the SFA contingent to KL last week. So glad to be back and glad to be here to give this talk with you. As Nicole said, today's topic is going to be a follow-up to the first session. And what we're going to be focusing on today is how we're going to demonstrate that what is expected of an organization, namely accountability, has been effectively and successfully implemented by the organization. And the tool that we're going to use to do that is the data protection management plan. Right, so I see that Lucas is raised his hand up. So I'm just wondering, is there any particular issue or is there a question that you would like to raise? I think if there's any questions, I think you can feel free to put that in the Q&A box and we can address them at the end. Right, so just kicking off with a recap of sort of this three-part webinar series that the PDPC and SFA have put together. We are at part 2. If you would like to revisit part 1, there is a video recording that the SFA can make available to you, I believe. And part 3 will be at the end of June. So stay tuned for that as well, I guess, if you're interested. So very quickly, just to recap what we went through in the first session, we primarily covered an overview of the Personal Data Protection Act, or PDPA, and we established that the PDPA is intended to govern the collection, use, and disclosure of personal data by organizations, with the critical balance to be achieved between two competing considerations. Namely, on the one hand, the need for organizations to use, collect, and disclose their data for their reasonable purposes, because nowadays almost all of business is really driven primarily by data, and I think that's particularly the case for fintech companies like all of us in the SFA. And on the other hand, the other competing need for individuals to protect their personal data. So your customers, employees, whoever's personal data you're collecting, there is a need that is recognized under the PDPA for those individuals to have certain protections and rights over their personal data. We also went through very briefly the PDPA's data protection obligations, which span the full data protection lifecycle. So starting from your collection of personal data in the blue box there, followed by the green box at the bottom, whereby when you've collected the personal data, what you're supposed to do to take care of it. And next, in respect of the personal data that you have, what rights can individuals access or what protections do individuals have under the PDPA in respect of that personal data. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the yellow box at the top, accountability, which kind of sounds like the least impactful obligation because it's so kind of broad-based and kind of less specific in terms of what needs to be done compared to the rest of the obligations. But it's also arguably, in the PDPC's view, the most important obligation because it's kind of the underpinning principle that supports the entire personal data protection framework of the PDPA. So which brings us to really the topic for today. How you're going to demonstrate that accountability that really underpins all of the data protection obligations, and really demonstrating your ability to achieve that accountability to both the PDPC, who will be quite interested in it in the event of any kind of investigation, as well as all of your customers, data subjects, whoever. Right, so the tool or the sort of framework that the PDPC has conceptualized to achieve this level of accountability is called the Data Protection Management Program. So what we're talking about when it comes to this DPMP is not so much specific obligations that you need to comply with in terms of what are the obligations under the PDPA, but instead we're going to be looking at the how. How can an organization effectively achieve accountability under the PDPA? So it's not so much really like the specific steps that each obligation requires, but really as an overall structural framework within your organization, within your company, how can you do so in a way that's effective, in a way that makes sense across your organization? And so it's not like just like random the DPO just by themselves trying to fight all the data protection fires, which is if you're a DPO, you will know that it's quite a thankless job. And honestly, quite a difficult task for one person to do themselves, lah. It's what we're trying to look at is really to achieve something from top down, an organization-wide level of accountability. So this is the framework that the PDPC has developed. There is a guide that's available on the PDPC's website. You can have a look at that guide. There's also certain resources that the PDPC has made available on its website that you can utilize to develop this DPMP. But during today's session, we're going to talk through a little bit about this framework, and so you can understand a little bit better what it means to really develop this data protection management program and the different steps that an organization should take to have this implemented. I'm going to go through the different steps in a bit more detail, but just very broadly as an overview, the first step is governance and risk assessment. So it's at a very macro level or at the top level of the organization, your C-suite, your management, your directors, establishing the appropriate governance structure, setting the foundation, or rather if you can think of foundation at the top level, the foundation for the overall data protection framework to exist. That's starting from the top down. Next, policy and practices. So specifically, what are the organization's specific policies and protocols when it comes to data protection and managing personal data? Next, once you have that policy in place, how do you operationalize it? How do you convert what's on the paper written on the policy? How do you convert that into an actual day-to-day process within your organization? And finally, once all of those good things are in place, how do you maintain them and keep them up to date? Right, so the first step, governance and risk assessment. So if you recall what I said, it's what is really necessary here is a high level of buy-in and proactiveness on the part of senior management when it comes to data protection. As I mentioned, it can't the objective of accountability and data protection in the organization cannot just be the sole responsibility of the DPO lah. The DPO is obviously the main person in charge, but he or she will need the backing and the organizational structure that's put in place by the board and senior management of the company. So what the senior management can do in this case will be things like defining the overall corporate values and principles in line with data protection to really send a signal from the top down that, hey, data protection is an important principle and it's an important value of our organization. Next, to provide strategic guidance to the DPO and to the rest of the company in terms of how data protection should be implemented. Next, to continue to exercise its supervisory and monitoring role as part of corporate risk management, to exercise the necessary approval of data protection policies and impact assessments where they're needed. Also things like, very importantly, budget and manpower that needs to be deployed across the organization to achieve accountability. Appointing and empowering the data protection officer. As I mentioned, the DPO is going to be the main guy responsible, but he or she will need the backing of the management to do it. Advocate data protection training, send the right signals. If the management is very proactive about being trained in all these things, that will set the appropriate tone for the employees to do so as well. And finally, in the event of any kind of complaints or data breaches, investigations by the PDPC, the management does need to take charge of the situation and provide the direction and steer the company through those data breaches or investigations. Right. So just zooming back in particular on the appointment of the DPO. I mentioned several times that the DPO has to be the main person who is responsible for data protection, compliance, or accountability within an organization. And that is because it's a mandatory appointment that's required under the PDPA. So every organization needs to have a DPO who is formally appointed. And when by formally appointed, I kind of mean that it has to be written down somewhere, the scope of the responsibilities, the actual appointment being made of this person. And it's not usually sufficient to just say like, hey, you compliance guy, you're also a DPO. Hey, just settle these things. It's good to have a formal appointment in place so that when a PDPC asks for it, you can demonstrate that, hey, this person was formally appointed by the company to be the DPO. Next, in addition to overall compliance, I think what would that mean in further detail would be having a data protection culture that's fostered amongst employees, communicating the data protection policies to various stakeholders, managing data protection related queries and complaints, and also to alert management to any risk that might arise with regard to personal data. And finally, to liaise with the PDPC on data protection matters if necessary. Right. So just one point to highlight, I think when it comes to registering the DPO with ACRA, organizations are encouraged to do so. There's a link that you can do so on the ACRA BISFA website, but it's not a legally mandatory requirement, unlike the appointment of a DPO, but is nevertheless encouraged by the PDPC. Right. So next, so going back to the overall role of senior management. So I went through a couple of the points just now. And I think really another one that I kind of want to focus on again is the risk assessment or risk management role of the management. Ultimately, the management needs to have an understanding of the various risks that come with processing personal data, that come with handling compliance with the PDPA, and those risks need to be reviewed on a regular basis to take into account, how the business is changing, what new technologies that the business is deploying, new laws, new changes in regulations. If you're gonna take up a new, for example, you're transitioning from a B2B model to a B2C model, that's going to entail a significantly higher level of data protection, or personal data being processed, and correspondingly a higher level of data protection risk. So all these things need to be borne in mind by the management, and they really need to have data protection kind of imprinted into their decision-making processes. So these risks would include strategic risks, so risks affecting the achievement of strategic objectives of the organization, day-to-day operational risks, so risks affecting the ops of the organization, compliance risks, so when it comes to complying with legal regulatory requirements like the PDPA, and also financial risks, so things that can affect the financial process of the organization, like accounting, reporting requirements, and things like that. Another key aspect, and I think I alluded to this earlier, is the need or the ability for management to really set the culture and tone of the organization right when it comes to data protection. Ultimately, data protection is something that needs the buy-in of management as well as everybody across the organization. So this development of this culture of accountability is really crucial. If nobody is bought into it, if nobody has this culture, if nobody is thinking about data protection, it's very, very easy to forget about it. It's very easy to make mistakes. It's very easy to inadvertently breach the PDPA and cause the organization a lot of trouble, right, when it comes to regulatory breaches and investigations like that. So what this means is that personal data protection should be recognized and practiced by all levels of the organization. In particular, staff that handle personal data or are responsible for implementing data protection measures like sales or IT. These staff in particular need to have need to be more alert and aware of what the organization's policies and practices are in terms of data protection, and receive and undergo more training in that front. data protection awareness and education needs to be implemented top down, because like I said, it needs to be something that's directed by the management so that the business can follow. The trainings and briefings need to be designed according to the roles of the organization, and whatever measures and topics there are need to be clearly built into the staff training and communicated to them clearly. On top of that, can consider having regular circulars to generate awareness and foster that culture of personal data protection. If something that is constantly repeated by management, the message will be received by staff to understand that hey, data protection is important. Right. So having sort of established and talked about the baseline foundation that needs to be set by management when it comes to data protection, we'll move on to the next big step, and I think this is the one that could potentially need the most sort of work in terms of actually developing the policies and practices of data protection within the organization. I think thankfully these can be done with the assistance of external consultants who are very experienced in developing these policies, such as lawyers and other kind of consultants. But it's still an important step, because ultimately whatever policies and practices are developed needs to be tailored to the specific business of the company. There's no point having generic policies that just say, yeah, we got to keep data safe. Yeah, we got to get consent. I mean, those are correct under the PDPA, but they don't mean anything if they're not tailored to the organization's policy, the organization's actual business. It needs to be specific in nature, that really targets the actual activities when it comes to day-to-day data handling of the employees, like dealing with specifically how the organization gets consent. If you conduct business via app or website, then that's going to be your primary a vehicle of customer communication and personal data collection. Then your policies and processes need to be tailored towards that angle, right? It needs to be okay when it comes to people who visit our website. What is our policy in terms of collecting their data? People who sign up for our mailing list via our website, what is our policy for that? People who sign up for an account on our platform, what is our policy when it comes to dealing with their personal data, and how we collect it when they sign up for a user account? So ultimately, this slide is just giving you a broad checklist in terms of what you might want to think about putting into your data protection policy. And as I mentioned, the ultimate objective is to be very clear and specific as to what exactly employees are supposed to do when it comes to handling personal data in their day-to-day work, who is responsible for what are the do's and don'ts that you should do. And that's for internal policy. And when it comes to external policy, then it's also communicating to those external parties what can they expect from the company in terms of the company's data protection policies and processes. Definitely, the internal policy is going to be much more detailed, because it's really going to be a very rigorous list of responsibilities and rigorous list of do's and don'ts for the employees to be aware of. Because I guess if you don't spell it out very clearly, then people may not be aware. People might be confused as to what they should or shouldn't do. Whereas for an external level, you don't want them holding you to very specific obligations that you put on yourself, but rather I think it's meant to convey to them a general sense of of how your organization is handling their data. So that's not to say you don't be specific at all, but the level of specificity you provide is really tailored towards helping them understand how the data is being handled, rather than understanding what exactly every employee in the company is doing. So what goes into the policy, if you look at the slide, it will start with general things like at the headers and stuff like that. What personal data does the policy apply to? What is the purpose of the policy? Who is the owner of the policy? When was the policy last reviewed? How's the policy aligned with the overall broader values of the organization and business code of conduct? Next, the next category is people. So who is the intended audience? Is it for employees? Is it for specific departments like the sales team or the IT team, for example? And when it comes to these people, what are their specific roles and responsibilities? Can they be set out clearly? And as I mentioned, who is the policy owner? Who approves the policy? Normally it's quite common to have version 1, this person is the owner of the policy and it was last updated on this date, something like that. Right, next important category, and this is really the meat of the policy, is the processes lah. So all those things that I mentioned, and I guess what's here is just some examples of what kind of processes you might want to put into it. Commonly, when it comes to a personal data protection policy, or at least the way that we will prepare it for our clients, it will map the data protection obligations. So if you recall the diagram that I put earlier, that there are 11 obligations that you want to deal with under the PDPA, so your policy will match that. So, for example, the consent obligation, okay, how do you get consent? When must you get consent? When are the exceptions to consent? Next, the notification obligation. How do we normally notify our customers of our collection of personal data? And how do we get consent that's tied to that notification? So it's really specific processes like that. They all are spelled out in the policy so that everyone is aware. I think I just want to call out perhaps a few important points out of this list here. I think, for example, dealing with queries, I think that's important because what we like to tell our clients is that when it comes to queries that are received by any employee, that it doesn't matter whether the employee is like, a receptionist or the CEO or the DPO or whatever. From the eyes of the customer or the data subject, their feedback or query has been received by the company. So it's important to communicate internally whenever there's any kind of query that's received, any kind of complaint that's received, what is the correct channel to channel those to. So for example, all queries must be sent to the DPO, CC the legal team, for example, or something like that, right? When it comes to a complaint, please direct them to write into this email address so that there can be a record of their query in writing, for example, something like that. The next one I want to zoom in on is how should data incidents and data breaches be handled? The third one from the bottom. So if you recall from the first session, I think this was a topic that I covered in quite detail because when it comes to data breaches, data incidents, I always say this, it's always a question of when rather than if. No matter how robust your data security is, no matter how much or how little personal data you handle, it's always every organization is vulnerable to some extent to a data breach. So it's very important to have this process that's set out in advance to really be very clear and explicit. How should data breaches be handled? Who's responsible for assessing whether the PDPC needs to be notified? What is the appropriate step to remedy or mitigate the impact of the breach? Things like that. Because when it comes to data breaches, it's always very time sensitive, very time critical. So that's why it's always helpful to have it very clearly spelled out in a policy that people can just take out. They can refer to it and understand, okay, step one, I got to do this. Step two, I got to do that. As opposed to, oh shit, in crisis mode, the data breach is happening. Everybody's just running around like headless chickens trying to figure out, oh no, what do we do? What do we do? So that's why policy is important in this kind of context. The last point I kind of want to zoom in on here is the second one from the bottom, DPIAs. DPIA refers to Data Protection Impact Assessment, and this is a fairly important but fairly often overlooked requirement or not a requirement, but facet of the PDPA. A DPI refers to a Data Protection Impact Assessment. Under the PDPA, there are certain specific situations where you need to conduct DPIs before you can do certain things. Typically, this involves things like if you're going to collect personal data without consent when you rely on a legitimate interest exception, you got to conduct a data protection impact assessment before you do so to assess that, hey, okay, if I'm going to rely on this legitimate interest exception, that actually the negative impact to the data subjects whose consent I'm not collecting is actually quite minimal, or is actually mitigated by or outweighed by the benefits of the data collection. Similarly, if, for example, I'm going to rely on deemed consent by notification, excuse me, deemed consent by notification to to obtain consent. So instead of relying of obtaining express consent from them, I rely on deemed consent. So I notify them, I send them an email, for example, and say that, okay, if you don't reply to me by this date, if you don't reply to me by this date, you will be deemed to have consented to my collecting your personal data for this purpose. And because again, the consent is being collected via a deeming mechanism rather than express consent, there's the expectation that you conduct a DPIA. But beyond that, beyond the situations in the PDPA where it's explicitly mandated that you conduct a DPIA, it's important to also note and spell out in your policy that a DPIA should be conducted um, whenever there's any kind of situation where there is a change in the organization's risk profile when it comes to personal data collection, personal data use, etc. So things would be, for example, you're going to onboard, you're going to transition to a new vendor platform, for example, that you're gonna change from one cloud provider to another. That could potentially entail some risk. So it's always helpful and useful to be able to conduct that DPIA to make sure that, okay, I'm going to make this decision. I'm aware of what is the potential impact from a data protection perspective. I understand the risks, and I'm going to address the risk in this manner. So again, I guess this is kind of a more important as a management level tool, but across all departments, I guess it can be applied at a more micro level as well. So like, your department is going to do something in particular. For example, the sales team is going to undertake a major sales campaign involving telemarketing, for example. So that's going to be a big decision that's being made by the sales team. There should be preferably a DPIA to be conducted so that the sales team, the head of the sales team, for example, is aware of what exactly is the data protection risk going into that campaign, and they know what to do and how to respond accordingly. Or rather, whether they should or shouldn't even go ahead with the campaign, right? If the data protection risk is so significant, and really is so much greater than the benefit of that campaign, then you might want to call it off entirely, actually, from a data protection perspective. Right. So next, having crafted your policy, having put it together, your really beautiful data protection policy is so comprehensive, everything's in there. There's a few more steps after that, right? It's not enough just to have that policy. One important step, and I'll talk about some of the other steps later when it comes to internal communication, but one important step is to communicate your policies to your customers. Again, as I mentioned, what you communicate to your customers is not going to be verbatim your entire internal policy, but what's intended is to really give them a clear understanding of how the organization is collecting their personal data and using their personal data in accordance with the PDPA. Like, for example, notification and consent. Customers understand where the notifications can be found or where the notifications are being provided to them, how they are giving their consent in the course of their interactions with the company. Is it through some kind of checkbox on the platform? Is it through by clicking some kind of button or whatever? They need to understand how they're giving consent. Is it by signing a form, for example? Policy updates, they need to know whenever there's changes in the policies. They need to know how they can exercise their rights of access and correction. For example, what is the correct channel to contact the organization when it comes to exercising the right of access and correction, as well as complaints. What is the correct channel for them to do so, and how can they expect to hear back from the organization in response to that complaint? So part of communicating with the customer, and I guess that form of communication is commonly referred to as a data protection notice, though they're not strictly always the same thing. So at this point, I guess it's helpful for us to highlight that the PDPC does have a tool on its website known as the Data Protection Notice Generator. It's meant to assist companies to generate basic data protection template notices to inform the organization stakeholders how they manage their data. So there is three kinds of templates. There's a customer template. So that template serves to communicate to customers what are the organization's policies and practices, as I just mentioned. And it's meant to be published on the website, mobile app, that kind of thing. There's also a template notice for employees, which is intended to be disseminated internally to ensure that all employees are aware of the organization's internal policies and are required legally, through the employee handbook or through their employment contract to comply with it. And also there's a template notice for job applicants. So when people apply to you, when people give you their personal data, their CVs, etc., when they submit their job application to you, they know how that personal data is being collected, for what purpose, and how it will be used by the company. Again, these are very general basic templates. So because it's a free to use tool, because it's basic templates, they're going to be limited in how specific or tailored they can be for your organization. So it's important to bear in mind that these are just general templates, and it's important to, again, make sure that it makes sense for your organization, make sure that it's tailored to your specific needs and your specific operational processes. And before you go ahead and do it, if you're not sure about anything, you are recommended to consult your legal team or external legal counsel for advice. Right, so having dealt with the sort of external aspects of things, when it comes to your policies and processes, having developed it, the next most important thing, and really perhaps the most important thing, is to ensure that your staff, and also potentially third parties who are engaged to process your personal data on your behalf, they are aware of what exactly is in the policy, and they know what they need to do, and they are bound to comply with those requirements and processes through some kind of legal mechanism lah. So what this means is to ensure that, for example, when it comes to the employment contract or employee handbook, there's a specific reference to the data protection policy that specifically says that you have to comply, you are expected as an employee to adhere to and comply with this policy. Similarly, when it comes to third parties who manage your personal data, it's important to make them aware, to the extent relevant to them, that they also need to ensure that whatever they do on your behalf as your personal data processor, is in fact compliant with what you have set, what policies you have set as an organization. These contracts, so you refer to the bottom, these contracts need to be regularly reviewed. So whenever you have a change in policy, or if you have some kind of legacy contract that may not have been updated on this front, you need to review those contracts to make sure that they are fully up to date, they remain in line with your organization's policies and practices. Next, it's PDPA training. So again, what is the objective here is to ensure that all employees are very clear and understand explicitly what exactly they need to do. So that's why they have training sessions, and that's why, like for example, the PDPC will engage us to help do some industry outreach efforts to educate people. But over and above that, the company needs to educate its own employees on the specific policies and processes of that organization. So not at a general level like what we do today, but at a very specific and granular level based on the organization's own policies. They need to be trained on that to understand what exactly they need to do. So that can be in a general level across the whole company, or at a specific level when it comes to specific teams or specific jobs and stuff like that. And this needs to occur both on an ad hoc basis. So for example, whenever people first join the company, they get like the basic training package when they first join, and also periodically. So year on year, there should be an annual training session so that people remain reminded of their obligations or requirements of the policies and processes. And they're also reminded or updated on any kind of new policies that are put in place, whether in response to changes in the law or just changes in business needs or things like that. Why this is important is because ultimately the policy is just a piece of paper lah, right? It's just some words on a paper that people have written down. Oops, sorry. It's just a piece of paper where some people have written down some words. It's a statement of intent, it's a statement of what the organization wants to do. But ultimately, it comes down to the employees, the individual people who are handling the data, to effectively implement it lah, right? To actually translate what is on the document into their day-to-day operational processes, so that whatever is being done by the company is in fact in line with those policies and processes, and is in fact in line with the PDPA. I emphasize on this because it's an important thing that the PDPC looks at when it comes to assessing an organization's compliance with the PDPA. It's not enough to just demonstrate that you have a policy, but you have to demonstrate that your policy has been effectively implemented by the company, so that the PDPC is satisfied that whatever you have on the policy is not just written down on the paper, right? It's actually reflective of what the organization does in handling personal data. And finally, when it comes to what's in the policy, right? Another important thing to bear in mind is to translate what is in that policy into a mindset that it's more proactive looking. So what normally is referred to is data protection by design. So whereby when there's any kind of project, when there's any kind of new initiative, the protection of personal data is a very key consideration right at the start and throughout the life cycle of the project. Um, a common pitfall that organizations suffer from is that, okay, they go ahead with all the more exciting things like, okay, we're going to make so much money doing this, or we're going to transition to this platform and be so much more effective. But if you don't consider the data protection issues right at the start, if you only consider them at the end, it's going to be a lot more effort to really undo or unwind whatever you've already done to that point to try and accommodate data protection lah. I think the important thing to communicate throughout the organization is to ensure that when it comes to data protection, it's important to bear in mind those issues right from the start, so that whatever you're designing, whatever you're developing can be built around it and can take it into appropriate account as a key facet of whatever you're doing rather than as an afterthought. Okay, so moving on to step 3. There's a bit of overlap between what I just said in step 2 and step 3 in the sense of operationalizing your policies into practice. So what we're talking about here in step 3, the training, all that is kind of part of it, but what we're talking about now is also other kind of operational measures to ensure that whatever processes you have put in place, whatever policies you develop are effective, right, within your organization. So what this could involve would include things like, for example, risk identification and mapping. There are tools that the PDPC has developed or has made available, like data flow and consent registers, to help identify and map risks relating to personal data within your organization so that you can design controls around it. The PDPA has a free assessment tool for organizations, the PATO, which is available at that link there. And it's a free online self-assessment tool that can give suggestions based on whatever inputs you give into the tool, and recommend resources to help organization improve its data protection policies and practices. So to kind of help you to see where the gaps are in your policies and practices, this is a tool to help you in operationalizing that and to plug those gaps. Next, a personal data inventory map. So that is referred to in the guide. There isn't a specific tool that we have to do this, because ultimately it's very organization specific lah. It's really a map of where personal data sits in every part of your organization and who is responsible for it. So that way you don't lose track of any kind of personal data, and at all times someone is accountable for their personal data lah. Other kind of tools that you might want to bear in mind will be consent registries. So these are records of the consent that have been provided to the individuals, provided by the individuals to the organization. Because if you recall from the first session, what I said was that when it comes to consent, there is a scope of the consent that's being provided based on the purposes you notify to them. And any new things that you do outside that scope of consent that was provided, you need to get fresh or additional consent from the individuals in order to do those new things. So this consent registry is helpful as a concept or as a tool to help you have a record and map out what exactly has been consented to by each group of individuals, so that you when there's some kind of new thing that you want to do with it, you can check back against this consent register and see, okay, is it within the boundaries of the consent that I've already obtained, or is it outside that scope of consent, meaning that I need to go and get new consent. Finally, the data flow illustration tool is kind of similar to the personal data inventory map, but more in terms of a flow chart rather than a static map lah. So it helps you to visualize and be aware of within your company where data is going across the company or through different teams or whatever at various points of the cycle lah. So, for example, the data is collected on this website, which is hosted on this server, is transferred to my organization's cloud server on this other server. It's then sent to my head office or my subsidiaries in this other country for their use in whatever. Finally, it's after all that is done, it's stored in this other server for this whatever purpose. So it's just for you to know where data is flowing at different points, so that you know and you can respond to the need to address those flows. For example, by making sure the consent covers those flows, or by making sure that whoever is receiving the data within those flows is bound by the necessary obligations to keep the data safe lah, as part of the data flow chain. Again, risk identification and assessment, but we're talking about the DPIA now lah. So I did talk about this earlier. So this slide is just reiterating that point lah. And reiterating the importance of a data protection impact assessment as a tool that organizations should deploy and should use to achieve a successful management of personal data. So what the DPI will do is to help identify the personal data that's being handled, how the data flows through the system, what are the risks involved, how the risk can be addressed, and ensure that those identified risks are addressed before the system is implemented. So it helps you it's a process to help you think through these things, to put them down on paper, and so you know what needs to be done before you do or don't do certain things. When it comes to assessing the risk, these can be determined by considering the following 3 industry recognized parameters. So confidentiality to data, integrity of data, and availability of data. These are by no means an exhaustive list of the risks that can arise out of a DPIA, but they are the 3 sort of most common or core risk areas that have been identified within the industry as being important to consider when it comes to any kind of data protection impact assessment lah. Right, so I talked about the PDP assessment tool earlier. This is just another diagram that kind of shows you what it looks like. So again, the link that you can use to access that is below there. Right, so the earlier few slides, we talked about identifying the risks, being aware of the different risks that exist when it comes to data handling in your organization. That brings us neatly into this next point about risk remediation and control. So once you've identified the risks, how do you address them? What do you need to do to address those risks? Again, this is by no means like, the magic cure towards all data protection risks, but these are just some core considerations that you might want to bear in mind, such as putting in place system-based and process controls and measures. So this refers to your sort of IT systems, and how you should develop them, how you should configure them, and how you should build in data protection measures into them to ensure that whatever risks to data across your data flow that you've identified in your personal data inventory map, those are all adequately addressed. So where there's personal data that's being stored at rest, there's some kind of database. For example, how should you encrypt the database? What level of security should you put in place for the database in terms of administrator access, in terms of 2-factor authentication, restricting of user access to specific teams, specific employees who need to access their data, things like that. That will make your organization's overall IT security posture, data protection posture much more resilient if you have those things in mind. And having done that data inventory map, having done that data flow map, it's much easier to decide what kind of tools, processes you want to implement in response to the risk you've identified earlier. The next big category of risk that you might want to think about is managing your vendors. And I think that will be talked about a lot more in further detail in our 3rd session in June. But at this point, suffice to say, it's a key area of risk that many organizations don't address properly, because what you're doing is you're trusting someone else, like, right? You're trusting a third party to do something that creates risk for you, right? You are trusting a vendor to handle personal data on your behalf when it's your personal data, it's your customer's personal data, and you bear the brunt of the risk. So it's very important to be very clear in terms of how you manage those vendors. For example, things like communicating your requirements and policies to them, um, not just verbally, but also putting them in the contract so that it's very clear and legally stipulated what exactly you need to do in terms of personal data protection. And I think that's the kind of the second point in the second bullet point there, right? There should be a binding contractual agreement that highlights their responsibilities. And in addition, if it's going to be an international transfer, there are additional requirements that need to be complied with under the transfer limitation obligation of the PDPA. Right. So having talked about risk identification, risk remediation, now there's risk monitoring and reporting. They're all kind of part of the same process. But essentially what this refers to is having an operational monitoring system that is designed to be able to monitor the occurrence of residual risk or ad hoc risk. And there should be internal reporting processes that are designed for escalation to management so that management is kept aware of all the different risks that exist. They're aware when something goes wrong, when there's something about to go wrong. They are kept in the loop and they can respond accordingly. So what the organization may want to think about is to develop the reporting process, the channel, and also the frequency of the reporting so that there can be a very clear and regular flow of feedback from the working level to senior management when it comes to data handling. Because ultimately, the management kickstarted the process, right? They kickstarted the culture, they developed the foundation, but on a day-to-day level, the people handling the data would be the regular employees who are deployed to handle the data. So there needs to be that feedback chain backup, like to say that, hey, okay, this policy doesn't make sense. I have this issue, or it's making my life very difficult. Is there an easier way to do it? Or things like, hey, actually the policy only covers 60% of what I'm doing. There's this 40% that's not addressed by the policy. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. Can you let me know? So that's the kind of feedback chain that needs to exist from the bottom up. So the initial top-down signal was sent, and there needs to be bottom-up feedback that is sent back up in terms of the risks that are identified and feedback fed back up to management. Okay, and just finally on the point about risks and how handling those risks, I did mention earlier that it's important to have a data breach policy and plan to respond to those data breaches because, as I said, you want to have all these steps that clearly documented in advance, and also to have training on these steps, so that when it comes to the actual data breach, people know what they need to do. They are very clear, they're calm, they can respond effectively instead of being in a panic and doing and making mistakes, right, making the problem worse, exposing the company to more liability or more further damage from the incident. There is a data breach management guide that the PDPC has created to help you think about these things. And the useful acronym that the PDPC has come up with is CARE. So that plan will cover the four steps, right? Containing the breach, so which is preventing further compromise of the data, implementing mitigating actions to minimize the harm from the breach. So for example, if it's like some kind of cyber attack, you want to immediately isolate that system, take it down, disable its connection to the internet so that whatever kind of damage cannot be continued or cannot be spread. Data cannot be exfiltrated out of the server back to whoever through the internet. Next, assessing the risk. So having sort of limited the harm, having addressed the immediate impact of the breach, you need to assess the risk. So figure out what happened, how exactly did we get attacked, what was the vulnerability that was exploited, and what we've done so far. Is it effective? Have we actually contained the breach, or is there more that we need to do to further mitigate the impact of the incident? Or what else needs to be done? Next, reporting the incident. So this refers to two things. I think that this refers to the mandatory data breach notification obligation under the PDPA, which includes notifying both the PDPC and the affected individuals if required based on the notification thresholds. But also broader than that, is there anybody else that you need to report to? Is there a contractual obligation for you to report this to certain customers, to certain business partners if you're processing their data, to a stock exchange, for example, if you are a listed company, or some other regulator if you're regulated by some other entity like the MAS, for example. And finally, evaluating the response and recovery to prevent future breaches. So this is kind of the most long-term forward-looking thing, right? Having assessed what happened, how do we effectively address the root causes of the incident to make sure that incident and similar incidents don't happen again? How can we beef up our security posture in general? Or if it's not an IT related issue, if it's like, for example, an organizational or operational issue, like someone mistakenly sent an email to the wrong recipient containing a whole bunch of personal data, or send customer B's data to customer A by accident. How do we implement processes to prevent that mistake? Because yes, we recognize that it's human error, mistakes are going to happen, but we can put in place processes to make sure that those mistakes are less likely, or if they happen, the impact is significantly lessened. So for example, there are different email tools out there that, okay, if you send the email to the wrong person, or they can detect right, if that the email is being sent to a recipient who you wouldn't normally send this to, and it'll prompt you, hey, are you sure you want to send this email to this person? So you can consider implementing a tool like that if it's a problem, or if the issue was a result of that kind of incorrect email recipient. Right. So the final step 4. So as I said, having put in place your culture, having developed your policies and processes, having operationalized them, and being sufficiently having a full risk awareness and risk mitigation framework in place. The final step is maintenance. So how do you keep it going? How do you keep this whole framework that we develop up to date? Very directly, organizations should routinely review their policies and practices to identify gaps and put in place the appropriate remedies through effective oversight. So depending on what we're talking about, there should be a regular review that's established. So this could be annual, this could be quarterly, depending on, for example, the whole policy can be reviewed annually, but certain specific processes can be reviewed quarterly based on like, for example, the feedback chain that I mentioned. So there is a feedback that is received from management, given to management on a quarterly level, and management will translate that into a quarterly update of whatever policies and processes. It can be helpful to establish an audit structure. So this can be internal or external audits. I think obviously you'll probably do the internal audits more frequently than external audits. But this is the structure that you can put in place to effectively monitor and evaluate how you've implemented your data protection policies and practices. And I guess finally, just to briefly touch on it, if you want to test or affirm the policies and processes that you put in place, you can think about going ahead and getting certifications, such as the PDPC's Data Protection Trust Mark Certification, or DPTM, which will serve as a badge or affirmation or certification of your organization's achievement of that goal level of compliance under the PDPA. Similarly, or on a continuation of that note, if you're going to update your policies and processes, it's important to be aware of things that are changing, both inside the organization and outside. So it could be things like changes in laws, changes in regulations, changes in technology, new risks that might exist. Like, for example, there's a certain new vulnerability that Microsoft has discovered or that Apple has discovered. So you've got to make sure you address that. Or for example, there's a new ransomware that is becoming very popular, that's being regularly deployed. How can you protect yourself against that? Things like that, right? So it's important to make sure that your policies and processes are alive in that manner. They are kept up to date based in response to developments both inside and outside the organization. Sorry, I realize I talk about mostly external changes, so I guess internal changes would include new business engagement, new business model, data incidents, something went wrong. There's going to be a new system, new process, new platform they're migrating to, things like that, right? So those are internal changes. Right. So again, we'd like to end off on what are the help and resources available for organizations when it comes to um, putting in place whatever we just talked about when it comes to a data protection management plan. I dealt with these in a bit more detail in the first session, but suffice to say there is a wealth of resources that the PDPC has been available for free on the PDPC website. You can go and visit it, you can go and explore to find out more. You can look back to the first session if you want a bit more detail about some of them. And I guess what I will conclude is to say that having in place this data protection management plan and achieving accountability across the organization is definitely not an easy task. It's gonna take effort, it's gonna take buy-in, it's gonna take resources. So the PDPC is trying to help, particularly our SMEs, for example, who we understand have cost constraints when it comes to achieving the necessary level of compliance with the PDPA. So these resources are there to help with that. But the expectation is ultimately that these are just here to kind of help you develop that baseline level of compliance with the PDPA. And what is really expected is much more beyond that. I think these really just serve as the building blocks for you to build a much more comprehensive data protection management framework over and above what the resources have been developed, what the resources have been provided, sorry. Right. So this brings me to the end of the second session. I would be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin, for sharing. So maybe let's move on to the Q&A session. So first question, can the DPO function be outsourced?
Yes, that is correct. The answer to that question is yes, it can be outsourced. Our firm provides DPO sort of DPO function as a service. There are other vendors out there who do the same thing. So definitely that there's no reason why the DPO function cannot be outsourced. There's nothing in the PDPA that prevents that, rather. But I guess I would caution that ultimately the outsourcing of the function doesn't include the outsourcing of the responsibility. So your company still remains responsible for complying with the PDPA and whatever things I mentioned earlier about the management buy-in, the employees having to do certain things, those still rest with the company. But yes, I think you can outsource the DPO function to a specialist, to someone who has the expertise, who has the know-how, experience in being a DPO, to help you with that particular function. So yes.
Okay, the next question, how to check if the organization has already appointed a DPO?
I guess only the organization will know. I mean, this is a internal thing, right? So I don't know if you're talking about your own organization or another organization, but within your own organization, the company itself has to know, right, who is appointed as a DPO or whether it's done so. If you're talking about another company to check whether they've appointed a DPO, it's not possible to check for sure. That, like I mentioned earlier, there is an ACRA registration that companies can register their DPO with ACRA so that it's available there. The details are available there. But it's not guaranteed that every company will have done so. So there isn't a specific and direct way to check if the company has done that. But what I would add is that it is an obligation under the PDPA for every company to make available the contact details of its DPO. So if you really want to know who is the DPO of a company, you can go ahead and ask that company, and they are actually required to have the information made public to you, whether in response to your question or published somewhere on some website or something like that for public access.
Thank you, Justin. I hope that answers your question. Okay, so next question, if a person share his or her business card with you, can you automatically assume that their data can be used for commercial purpose?
Okay, so there's a number of things that are at play here, lah. There is a concept under the PDPA called business contact information. And that is defined as, very broadly speaking, information on a business name card. And in the context where if the business name card was given to you in a business context and not in a personal context. So for example, if it's like at a networking conference and the person gives you his card, that is considered business contact information. But if, for example, if like the person is just actually signing up for like, a gym membership at your gym, and he just gives you his card as a way for you to take down his details to sign up for the membership, and it's a personal gym membership, then the card wasn't given to you in a business context and is not considered business contact information. So assuming the card is business contact information, i.e. it was given to you in a business context, actually it is not covered under the PDPA. It's not considered personal data under the PDPA. So the obligations of the PDPA don't apply generally, lah. So in essence, you can go ahead and use that data for your commercial purpose. But I guess, sorry, Nicole, I guess I would just add the flip side to that is that if you're not sure whether it's BCI or not, then the next thing you'll be thinking of is whether there's consent and what is the scope of the consent that was given, lah. So by giving you the name card, there's some level of deemed consent that is being accorded. So depending on the context and the purpose and the situation in which the card was given to you, it would be possible to interpret the act of giving you the card as consent to use that card and the data on that card for a certain purpose. So this is over and above the whole business contact information thing, lah. So leaving that aside, there is another way of looking at it in terms of deemed consent and the fact that by giving you the card, he would have consented to the specific thing, reason why he had given you the card, lah. So if you process the data for that reason, then that's fine. Yeah, thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Justin. I think that's quite useful for everyone here. Okay, the next question, is a separate policy on personal data protection required, or can provisions be included in other policies and procedures?
That's a good question. I guess ultimately it comes down to how your organization is developing and deploying its policies and practices, lah. There is no specific requirement under the PDPA for the policy of data protection policy to be a standalone policy. But what we found that it's helpful to have it as a standalone policy so that it's very clear if there's any kind of question or if there's any kind of if the employee wants to know or the employee needs to go and check what exactly is their role and responsibility or what is their obligation when it comes to personal data handling, they know where to go and find that information, right? You can refer directly to the data protection policy document. Similarly, when it comes to any kind of data breach, for example, there is a document that you will go to, for example, the data breach management plan subsection of that broader policy. So to answer the question, it's possible to have it in different policies to spread out the contents of your data protection policy across different policies. But ultimately, the policies need to cover everything that needs to be covered. And if the PDPC asks to understand and they want to know what is your policy and do you have a policy, you need to be able to pull together all those different policies and paint the cohesive picture by looking at these policies in totality. This is our data protection policy. So I think as you can tell from my question and from my answer, it's possible, but it's generally easier to just have it as a standalone policy, lah.
Thank you, Justin, for sharing. Next question, how can you ensure that the third-party organization protects data according to the PDPA requirements? Can you indemnify yourself in case of breach?
So yeah, two parts to that question. I think the second part kind of already implies the answer to the first one. In that the way you would ensure that they comply is by putting in place some sort of contractual obligation for them to comply with certain things, lah. So over and above complying with the PDPA generally, you would typically want to be a bit more specific in terms of the specific obligations that you want, that you expect them to comply with in respect of your personal data, in respect of what they are doing for you specifically. So tailored really to the kind of data processing that they're doing on your behalf. To the second part of the question, can you require the third party to indemnify you in the event that they have that they cause certain losses to you in the event of their breach of the personal data handling obligations that you've imposed on them, or their breach of the PDPA, for example? The answer to that is yes, of course, you can do that, and if you can do that, that will definitely be beneficial to your organization in terms of managing the risk. But it's not always the easiest thing to negotiate, like, because I think as you all can imagine, indemnities are quite a sticky thing to get a counterparty to agree to. And furthermore, just because they indemnify you, it doesn't mean you're off the hook entirely, right? So the indemnity will serve to protect you from a contractual perspective, you and that vendor, and help to cover some of the financial burden of the financial aspect of that risk. But ultimately, the party who is responsible for complying with the PDPA and answerable to the regulator, the party whose name will be in the news when it comes to any kind of data breach, and who customers will come and look for and will blame when it comes to any kind of issue, will still be your company lah. So what I'm trying to say is ultimately, yes, you should manage your vendors, you should have contractual obligations. If you can get indemnity, great, but ultimately the responsibility still lies with your company.
Thank you, Justin. Another question asks, what is a difference between policy, process, and procedure?
Okay, I guess maybe this wasn't like super clear, but I guess I was hoping that it will, if you've thought about how your company functions, this might be evident. A policy is the document lah, right? The paper, the specific document that says what are what is expected, you know, what you're supposed to do in this situation, what you're supposed to do in that situation, what the company expect of you to do in this situation, what you must or mustn't do. So it's that document, that's the policy. The process is a specific operational thing that happens. So in the sense of so the policy says that whenever you collect personal data, you must make sure you have you must make sure that okay, so maybe just take a different example. If you're going to have a new business activity, the policy will say that you must check against your consent registry to make sure that consent has been obtained. Then the process would then be for the employee who is going to implement this new specific business activity. The process is the employee actually going to the register and checking. So that is the process. So the process could be even more detailed, like the employee must check 3 days before, and the employee must write some kind of report. So policy, the reason why when I talk about policy processes, they always go together, right? Because the policy will tell you what is the process that needs to be done, and the process is what is actually being done to implement what is on the policy. Procedure is kind of the same as process lah, so I think that's not really a different thing. But the two broad areas is policy and process, and they go hand in hand.
Thanks, Justin, for clarifying. Next question, is there any sample contract to share on the binding agreement with contractors?
I can't recall offhand if the PDPC website has a sample to that effect. I believe there might be something that could be used to that effect, but it may not be a sample like full contract lah. There could be some sample clauses that exist on the PDPC website. But I think if you would speak to, for example, your external legal advisors or your consultants, they might be able to share with you some samples that you could use lah. But again, I think the important thing I will emphasize is that a contract needs to be tailored to specific situations, specific circumstances, specific data processing activities. in order to be really effective lah. Otherwise it is just very generic clauses that only get you there like maybe half of the way.
Thank you, Justin. Another question asks, besides the care approach, what other approaches may we consider to address data breaches responsibly? Are there any sector-specific measures, example, those implemented in fintech startups, FMCG companies, etc.?
Well, I would say that the care framework is not meant to be overly prescriptive lah. I think it's there to exist as a framework that tells you the different stages of a data breach and what you need to do at different points in time lah. So when it comes to the immediate response to the breach, when it comes to okay the first 24 hours or first 48 hours, what you're going to do immediately, the next 2 or 3 days, what are you going to do in terms of assessing the risk and the impact. It helps you to think about who you need to notify, and finally, as you think about longer term, over the next month, 2 months, what you're going to do to mitigate and address the impact of the breach. If you want to come out with different acronyms, that's completely fine. But I think I would say that the care acronym that the PDPC comes up with is kind of that framework lah, right? It's the same framework. For other industries like fintech or FMCG, I would say that the care framework is actually fully applicable. Because like I said, it's meant to be a general framework. It's not meant to be very prescriptive in terms of a specific industry or other industry. So you can take the care framework, you can apply it to fintech. You can apply it to FMCG. And if you want to develop it into further detail, and I think that's important, it should be looked at organization specific level. So your organization, how do you flesh out that framework to be very clear? Okay, who's going to be activated? You're going to activate the CEO, or you're going to activate the DPO, you're going to activate legal. At which point there's forms get involved, that kind of thing. So that's the kind of detail you should be looking at lah, to flesh out the framework beyond the very basic CARE.
Thanks, Justin. Another question about DPO. Does the company need to give DPO an appointment letter for the post?
So as I mentioned at the start, it's helpful and it's recommended to have the appointment be formal and in writing lah. So this doesn't need to be an appointment letter, but it just needs to be documented clearly lah, right? That you have been appointed as a DPO of our company, and therefore you are aware and you accept that you're responsible for this lah, right? And something like that. It doesn't need to be overly formal. It doesn't need to be like a letter that's on some letterhead and signed and that kind of thing, but it should be in writing and it should be sufficiently clear and formalized that they are aware of the appointment line, and you can show the PDPC that this appointment did in fact happen.
Thanks, Justin. Second last question. When managing data as a service provider, who has the liability to collect the consent? The service provider or the client on behalf of whom we are collecting the data?
Right. So when it comes to service providers, the situation that you described sounds quite like a case where the data where the service provider is the data intermediary. What that means under the PDPA is that the service provider is only processing the personal data on behalf of the customer for the customer's purposes and not for any of its own independent purposes. In that circumstance, the data intermediary doesn't bear responsibility for the compliance with the consent requirement. The data intermediary only needs to be responsible for the protection obligation, the retention obligation, and the data breach notification obligation. The requirement to obtain consent would still sit with the customer. And it's really the customer who is the primary organization in this case, because it is on their behalf that the data is being processed, who needs to bear responsibility for the consent lah. And that's why typically it's helpful to spell out these things in the contract. But even if it's not spelled out under the PDPA, it's very clear that it's the customer who's responsible.
Thanks, Justin. Okay, so the final question, someone asked, as FI in Singapore, our DP policy does not need to seek customers' consent as it is mandatory to get their data to process transaction. But our policy stated certain obligations like how to protect, safekeep, cyber hygiene, etc. Are we at the right direction?
Okay, so 2 points. I think to the first point about as a FI, do you need to get consent? The point that whether you need consent or not, as a regulated entity in a certain industry, there's a few things to think about. But what I guess what you're alluding to is the fact that under certain laws or regulations involving FI, there is a specific legal requirement for you to collect data without consent. And I think one of the common things that this refers to is for the purpose of AML and KYC measures. Because of the MAS's AML KYC policies, if you are bound by the MAS's AML KYC regulations or notices, because those MAS rules specifically say that you should and you can collect personal data without consent, then there's no need for consent. But otherwise, there isn't actually a blanket MAS rule that says that as a FI, because you can collect personal data without consent for all transactions lah. I think that's probably taking a bit too broadly lah. I mean, if there's a specific regulation that you might want to point me to, or you can point to that says that you can, then that's fine. But I'm personally not aware of any kind of specific regulation that's that broad lah. So you may to the first part of your question, you may want to think about the extent to which you are actually permitted to collect data without consent. And for anything outside of that, if there's you would then need to look at whether there's any kind of other exception under the PDPA that allows you to collect data without consent. And then finally, if there's no MAS exception, if there's no PDPA exception, then you should go and think about how to get consent, because then consent is required. To your point about what should be in your policy, it should address, like what I said, all the data protection obligations under the PDPA. So the consent is one thing. You should go and think about to what extent that's needed and put that in your policy. Even if consent is not needed, I would say that you should put it in your policy anyway, because then it's very clear in what situations consent is not needed, right? Then it's very clear to the employees, okay, when we're doing these activities, we don't need consent, or we're doing these other activities because it's not permitted, something that's specifically required by MAS to do so without consent, then we need to get consent. So actually consent does need to go into your policy also. But over and beyond that, then the rest of your policy should cover the rest of the data protection obligations lah. So you mentioned things like cyber hygiene, things like data protection, data security, for example. All those will be important things, and you should map those back to the PDPA's obligations to ensure that those are all covered adequately.
Thanks, Justin. I think we have covered all the questions.
Okay, cool. So
I think that's all for today. So thank you, Justin, for spending your time and sharing with us. For our attendees, don't forget to sign up part 3 of this series. You are eligible for a cert of completion if you attend all 3. Thank you once again for joining us, and have a great week ahead.
yeah, thanks everyone. Looking forward to seeing all of you at the third session in June.